Hi, I'm Dex Gelfand. If you're not familiar, I'm a therapeutic spiritual counselor. That's what I call my practice, therapeutic spiritual counseling. And I largely use techniques extrapolated from things I've learned or observed. And these can be very effective. This particular talk is going to be a little bit different in some sense than usual, in that I'm going to focus on a book written by actress Leah Remini, who's made a great name for herself, both as an actress and as someone who speaks out about the issues of the Church of Scientology. And I've been reading her book. And here I have to mention a disclaimer, which is that I knew Leah a little bit, or not really knew her, but was around her and observed her. When she was a little girl, her mom and I were friendly as we were both working in the New York Scientology organization. Her mom I found to be a really sweet, funny, vivacious person. I enjoyed her very much. So if I come across as a little biased, you could account for it that way. I mean, I do remember the television show Cheers, and spotting that the girl playing one of Carla's daughters was Leah. You couldn't mistake Leah. She, even as like a 3 or 4-year-old when I first saw her, she had this look in her eyes of, I'm a tough New Yorker, do not mess with me. She's still got that about her. It's a good strength in her sometimes, and it's actually kind of enjoyable to see. I'm happy for Leah in that she seems to have completely recovered from the effects of being abandoned and badmouthed by all the people that had been her friends in Scientology when she spoke out against the organization. I'm very happy for Leah. And when I picked up her book, I really didn't expect it to be as good a book as it is. I expected it to just mostly be her story about how, she was a victim of the Church of Scientology and all that she went through. And I was hoping that I would see her regain her strength and her power and her cocky New York attitude. Clearly she has. But the book is much more than that. The book is actually interesting and enlightening, and it's also much more about her life and her career, which is also interesting. Anyway, there's a particular passage in Leah's book, Troublemaker, and what I find very interesting is that she makes observations about what I find to be the key problems with how Scientology counseling or processing is done, that I haven't seen anybody other than me really mention before. So she makes some very astute observations here. I'm going to quote from a passage in the book. Excuse me for putting my cheaters on to get this right. Okay. Now I'm reading from the book here. Scientology auditing follows a precise series of steps. Each addresses one or more conditions that everyone supposedly needs to overcome. Thus, your auditor directs your problems as required for you to move up the bridge. Okay, that's the Scientology term for the steps or levels of advancing in self-improvement, self-realization, and spirituality as defined by Scientology. That's my aside there. Anyway, for example, the steps on the bridge predetermine what will be addressed next. The auditor would then say, quote, in looking at earlier interviews and auditing, I have found that in your life you have a problem with communication, unquote. Your auditor then proceeds to ask, quote, from where could you talk to your mother, unquote. You give various answers, but the auditor continues to come back again and again, looking for more answers. You grow frustrated and exhausted as the auditor comes back to you with the same question dozens of times, trying to unblock you. Then you surrender. You have a realization that gets the required reaction on the e-meter that signifies that this step is complete with a quote-unquote floating needle. You finally say, I can communicate with my mother from anywhere. Now, I will interject here that Lisa's description here of being frustrated and exhausted as the auditor comes back to you, that can happen. It does happen. Other times, that what's called a repetitive processing, repeating the same question over and over, can also bring about worthy realizations. It can, but what Lisa's describing does in fact happen, and it does in fact happen routinely when used the way it's described here, and I will continue now. In the end, the quote-unquote ability gained is that you can communicate with anyone on any subject. Through auditing, it has been proven unequivocally that you did indeed have this problem, but just were not aware of it. And now that it's been proven to you that you did have a problem with communication, and that problem has now been eliminated. At the end of every session, once the needle has floated, and if you're not familiar at all with Scientology e-meters and floating needles, floating needle is a needle on a dial, and floating means a particular motion that it can do, which is kind of smoothly back and forth, something like that, okay? And that's an indication frequently used to, where the auditor will tell you your needle is floating, then that's an indication that you've completed the process and gotten the intended result. So the auditor says, thank you very much, your needle is floating, we're going to end the session now. You now leave feeling that you've accomplished something. Didn't know that was there, but I'm clear of it. Pardon my French, I'm quoting Leah here, her words, but she says, but the mind fuck lies in the fact that they assigned you the problem and not the other way around. And afterward, if you realize that you still have a problem with communicating with your mother, you are taught that person is a non-Scientologist and therefore emotionally down-toned. I just paraphrased a bit there to make it clearer. Okay, but that's what Lisa is saying here. The process could produce a great sense of cathartic relief. Here was a problem I wasn't even aware of that I may have created for myself, and after much back and forth, I was able to overcome that problem. I just want to say here again, to interject, that is real. You can have a euphoric feeling, a sense of cathartic relief at the end of having something addressed that wasn't even something you considered a problem or was aware of as a problem before it was activated or triggered in the session. But that's true. There can be that sense of cathartic relief. So while in session, I would feel the euphoria of self-discovery and growth, back in the real world, I was still angry, depressed, and judgmental. Looking at my diaries from that period, I would note that I still wanted more for my life and my family's life. My Scientology realizations were great in the church building, but I would start cursing when I couldn't find my car in a parking lot, or when I had no money left in my bank account. It just wasn't there for me in real-life situations. This sense of accomplishment of having solved problems. It really existed only when I was in the presence of other Scientologists who completely bought into it. What I didn't realize at the time was that all the understanding I gained through auditing only related back to my life in the church and helped me be a Scientologist. My, quote, gains, unquote, in Scientology were not relating to the real world. I was so entrenched in the church that it had become my everything, and I couldn't question that. Okay, now, let me just say that that is a point that I make, is that too much of the approach of Scientology processing, even when done earnestly, misses the point because it isn't, in my terms, relevant. It's not what's on your mind. It's not what you're trying to solve. It's not what you're coming into the session hoping to resolve or feel better about or conquer. And that's the problem with the whole structured steps of what's called the Scientology bridge or levels. This standard set of sequence of techniques or processes that don't necessarily relate to what's on your mind. Okay, I've mentioned this before, but part of what Leah is explaining in the Scientology Technical Dictionary, auditing was defined as triggering or restimulating charge or emotionally charged material in order to then destimulate it and process it. Now that right there is what Lisa is talking about and what I've been talking about. I think that it's a failed, incorrect approach to find something in a person that you can trigger and make them feel, and then process that and give them this sense of relief and cathartic euphoria, because it's just not relevant. A person is approached by a Scientologist. A Scientologist is trained in the dissemination drill to ask them, find what in them they'd like to change, and then say Scientology can help with that. But then, in actual practice, more often than not, instead, what's being addressed in the sessions is not what the person is interested in addressing, not what they feel is ruining their life or making their life difficult or holding them back or giving them chronic unwanted feelings or sensations. Instead, there's that standardized, one-size-fits-all, long runway of sequence of processes. They call them processes, I would say techniques, that do address something, and more often than not, just result in this unimportant but impressive cathartic feeling of release or euphoria. It's kind of a parlor trick in a way. And because it's not recognized outside of Scientology, and there's this whole community of Scientologists, I believe, that are a little insecure about the relevance of their gains, and so they try to reinforce it within themselves and each other and the rules of Scientology. I can tell you that I've had many, many clients who did all or way deep into Scientology's higher levels, the OT levels. And then in the session, we would address things that were troubling them. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard, I'm finally handling, or I just resolved the thing that I got into Scientology in the first place to fix. It's finally being addressed, and now it's changed, and now I've got that result. And this can be like after $240,000 spent and 30 plus years spent in Scientology and thousands of hours of processing. And that is the point. That's the point Leah's making. However, I would mitigate what Leah's saying, because it's not always 100% that way. People do make meaningful gains in Scientology. It's not like it doesn't ever happen. It's just a bit hit or miss, and I think more miss than hit in terms of successfully addressing the correct things, the things that are important to the individual, instead of addressing what's important to the organization by the organization's paradigm and the organization's system. And that's why a lot of people come out of Scientology and say it's failed or it's no good. It's not that it's no good. There are benefits that can be gotten, but largely they miss the boat, because there's this demand to just follow the standard uniform sequence of steps and not truly address you as an individual in the most meaningful way, which is to take up what you want to take up. I think Lisa makes that point well. I make it in several of my articles and videos, particularly the video that's titled Love, Empathy, and Relevance. And I would recommend that you also watch that video. But oftentimes I'm in a position to explain to somebody who's been a Scientologist, or to somebody who sees that I mention Scientology and have a background in Scientology. Clearly I'm not a Scientologist, but I was, and I learned a lot from that passage, and I have no regrets about it. But the point is that if you really want to achieve your particular goals, for your abilities, for how you feel, for changing what's difficult or disturbing for you, well then, those are the things that have to be addressed, and not something else. And not the idea that we're going to completely handle the subject of communication, and then we're going to completely handle the subject of having done bad things, and then we're going to completely handle the subject of unwanted changes in your life. That's way too general, and it more often than not, it's not going to get you there. And that's why I've had so many clients who feel comfortable with me, first of all, because they're Scientologists and I have the background. But why I get so many of these people, because they're still seeking It's like the U2 song, I still haven't found what I'm searching for. That, in essence, is what most people with a lot of experience in Scientology come to me saying, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. So come to me, or someone who has that approach and that philosophy of, let's take up what you feel a need to address, what you want to do something about in yourself. And that is the successful way to achieve your goals through counseling sessions, to address those things that are relevant to you, and not to trust in or try to have faith or hope in the idea that sooner or later you're going to get there when you're not really addressing that. That's my talk for today. Hope you found it interesting, and you know how to find me. Thanks for listening.